Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a beautiful day. I just got off work or whatever, and my girl and one of her daughters is out front. They're gonna go to the water park today, but it's out of town. So, um, I want to talk to you guys today. I've been really digging deep into like deeper meanings and metaphors when it comes to the Bible and biblical things to try to help people understand that there are different points of view and that each of us have our own honestly journey when it comes to enlightenment and learning things. And so I want to give you something that came to my mind recently. And I told you I have found two people in history which makes this important to me. You have a man named Moses, who I call Moses, and then you have a man named Jehohanan, and I believe his name is Ben Zekai or something like that, but they mocked him and put Ben Hagios on his tomb. That's John. I call him John the Baptist. And the reason why those two figures are important are because they were at the exact same time in certain events that have been recorded in history. And what I've come to find out is that a lot of things that were in the Bible are actually historical events that have been turned into ulterior fairy tales and doctrine. So back to that book, the Bible. I'm going to give you guys an interesting prophecy. So if you remember in the beginning of the book, before there were curses and before there were anything like that, you would have had God, and I'm going to use actual character names, so it's going to be like book report logic. So you would have God, the original God, which creates things, and he creates things in such a way to where people seem to have comfort from the beginning. And then you would have Adam and Eve, right? Now, first of all, before I start into this, Adam and Eve weren't the first two people. If you read the creation story, all of humanity, creatures, animals, everything was already created. It would seem that Adam was created, and then based on the book, he named these things. Okay, so now back to Adam and Eve. If you pay attention to the timeline, they didn't have any punishments or curses until they were introduced and knew Satan. After they were introduced to and knew Satan, then they bore children, not before they were in pleasure land. And so, why is that important? The two children, you would have Cain, who was the bread bearer, and then you would have Abel, who was the sheep herder. Now, why is this important? You would have two men throughout that book, and both men introduced new doctrine or new ideas in terms of the Spirit of God. You would have the first man, which is Moses, and then you would have the second man, who is John the Baptist. Before anybody else came, if you pay attention to a timeline, if Jesus is going to be humble and truthful, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. John the Baptist came first. And so outside of the story that was written, because I go into real history and what actually happened, this whole Jews killing Jews and all sorts of stuff, no. But the point is, in this actual story timeline, the prophecy of Cain and Abel is a forecoming of Moses and John the Baptist. And the reason why this is important and how this all ties together is that Moses was the bread bearer. He originally was given an original law in his time of peace or rest on a mountain, but then he wrote an additional law in his time of wrath. Now, if you do anything in life, that's a testament, and we can all attest to that. When we do things in peace or when we're happy, we tend to get different results when we can concentrate and be aware of certain things. But when we do things out of frustration and emotions and anger, it tends to have different results. So, if you look at it, Moses wasn't happy with the bread that he had brought to the Lord at first because of what he saw happening through mankind, right? So then he became wroth and wrote a dangerous law and cursed the bread. Now you have a boy come later, John the Baptist, who was like a shepherd who was leading sheep, so to speak. Now this man who was doing that because of hold on one second. Now if you pay attention to the timeline of things, when he came to be a shepherd, what came with his sacrifice was anger and wrath. The reason why it was anger and wrath is because that's what the bread bearer put into the bread, so to speak. And then he became a living sacrifice to change things. And honestly, if you look at the sacrifice that's written, the prophecy of it, Abel was trying to sacrifice the firstborn of the flock. Who was the firstborn of the flock in this prophecy? You know what I'm saying? It's the same ideology in different words with Jacob and Esau. You know what I'm saying? Moses became a hunter of men, but then over time, it got tired. So then you have a man come later who took the blessing, but didn't know what he was signing up for. And then initially you have a situation where, just like the prophecy, he had the staff fought the angel, and it's like, what's your name? What do Christians and most people do? Argue over what? In this new generation of this new spirit, argue over their sex names and all this other stuff and what created what. And so the reason why I brought that up is because none of that, I believe, is some magical religious ideology. If I am able to decipher and look at things and create my own metaphors and create a higher level of thinking and consciousness, when I start to treat that book like a book reports, and then essentially when I start to pay attention and become more aware, I'm not so easily susceptible to all these curses and ideas that were written out of wrath and anger, and other ideas that were written out of sacrifice to try to heal others, but then look at it from my own consciousness awareness and create my own tales. But even when creating these tales, remember that there's a balance and I have to live in the real world. And a lot of times what people are doing is playing with witchcraft and playing with spelling. And a lot of these preachers and pastors know this, and they take the way of the hunter of men, and they seek to destroy men's hearts to rebuild an army of their own. And some people who follow after the apostles and different things like that become too sacrificial for their own good and end up sacrificing peace and harmony and mercy and end up destroying others. As you see with the Christians, the most bloody faction of humanity. So, food for thought. Eat it if you will, throw it in the garbage. Who cares?